And then I want to move on to talk about my adaptation. And I'll just say a little bit how I'm going to approach this. I first want to start off by talking a little bit more generally about adaptation as a concept, and then I want to go in and then look at three aspects of my own adaptation. So now let's just yeah. So first of all, on adaptation then. Pucher has claimed that in the process of adaptation, there is nothing in the text, complete though it is, to give definite instructions. The agency of adaptation, in other words, resides with the adapter, even though the adaptation occurs within a set of constraints. And I think this is a really useful way to think about adaptation, and I'm in general agreement with Pucher here. For one, I think such a view recognises that adaptations firstly can form quasi-independent works in themselves. So if we think about Goethe or Marlowe's Faust, or Seneca's Oedipus, that's clearly the case. But also it picks out the idea, no matter how slavish one is going to be to an originating text, the writer or the adapter has to make a series of narrative, narratological, and thematic choices which they can't escape from, even if they're really trying to keep as it were, shot for shot, a faithful adaptation as they're called, which I think is perhaps a problematic notion. And Tolkien actually, many years before this, makes a similar claim, but also in terms specifically of Beowulf, and he talks about the writer of Beowulf, and he says, "The plot was not the poet's, and though he has infused feeling and significance into its crude material, the plot was not a perfect vehicle for the theme or themes that came to hidden life in the poet's mind as he worked upon it." So Tolkien's point here, I think, says something about the status of the Beowulf poem itself as an intertext. It's something which is made and remade. But also again about the critical and creative agency of the adapter and the necessity of being a critical and creative agent when you're engaging with this kind of thing. So while the source text provides constraints then, and a series of constraints, they are more often than not, or they should be, enabling constraints. So you can imagine, English grammar provides a constraint upon the sort of sentences we can speak as English speakers or whatever speaker, but they're constraints that enable us to have talks on Beowulf and other such things. So that's a little bit on my general approach to adaptation, and I'll say here that when I'm going to be talking about the production, and I'm going to use this as a rather ontologically ham-fisted term. I'm going to be mentioning production to not only mean my adaptive process of a dramatic script, but also the live performance itself. And I know that there are going to be ontological and media differences between those, but I think for the present circumstances, it's practically the best thing to do. So, a little bit of a brief description of what this production was. So it was a production that initially went on in the Theatre Royal Brighton as part of the Out of Hours season last year. It's also going to be going on at the Brighton Fringe 2014. So if you did want to catch it, you certainly can. I think it's going to be souped up and rejangled with various directors. But it combined tabletop puppetry, music, poetry, and shadow puppetry. So there were quite a variety of forms there. And I think that's certainly significant when I come to talk about interdisciplinarity. But there are three aspects of the adaptation that I want to highlight as they reflect on my original reading of the text as I've talked about. So these are firstly the linguistic or poetic approach to the text. Next is the idea, the theme of art and humanity and the link between art making and humanity. And thirdly, the idea of Beowulf as a character. So again, sort of partly mirroring my reading of the text. So first then to the language and poetics of the production. At the level of text, it was necessary to eschew Old English. I don't know if there are many dramas out there in Old English, but I eschewed Old English and the poetic conventions largely of Old English in terms of accentual metre, because it was a dramatic production. I wanted to achieve something dynamic and to represent characters in different ways. So therefore, accentual metre had to be dumped, and I took up a more Frenchified approach to the text. And by Frenchified, I mean using rhyme. So And the way in which I did this is I tried to think about rhyme and meter as representing character, and and have a formal consideration of how rhyme and meter can affect character. So I'll give you an example. So you can't really, unfortunately, it's a bit too light to see this, but I'll go through a couple of characters and show you how I went about giving them voice. So Hrothgar, the Danish king, he speaks in iambic pentameter, which is generically appropriate for its heroic connotations. However, it's tempered by a rhyme scheme of A, A, B, which leaves a dead line or an unresolved line at the very end. So this works to suggest a lack of confidence, which, of those of you that are familiar with the original poem, is something that's really powerfully present in Hrothgar's character. He's not a very happy man, and he's a man that's quite self-doubting. And so here's an example of some of Hrothgar's speech. Now I'll try and drama it up a bit. So, my people, my kin, my men and women, help me build a hall in my kingdom's ken, to shut out the unwieldy wending of night. And then later on, my earthly hall, now clean and human, though the earth is full, pregnant and swollen, with much we must keep outside at arm's length. So he often starts off being quite sprightly and enthusiastic, and then poetically fades off with this unresolved line. So by using rhyme at all, it's possible then to refuse the expectation of rhyme for specific effect. And now we might think about Grendel. With Grendel, my first inclination was to reverse the basic order of English speech patterns, which are iambic. So I flipped it to the trochaic. So from unstressed syllable to stress, I worked it the other way and had a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. And I also gave Grendel a rather long line length, a heptameter. So here's some examples. And I should say that this is all the character voices are done by the poet, who is a character in himself. He's a character of a Saxon poet who comes out. Sometimes he speaks as the poet, and then sometimes he takes on the character voices of the puppets. But I can't quite. I'm not a skilled speaker, but he's got a very scratchy, squeaky voice for Grendel, and I won't do that. But I'll try and get the rhythm at least. Okay. Over bridge and road and path I walk my body, taken from my cave and moss and gloom solitary. I come to strip the flesh from your melody. You are new and tall and strong and lithe, but still scared, brought from far away through boats, through eddies with your oars. Yes, I'm real. To your stories I'll not be compared. So here he's first meeting Beowulf. This is on his first meeting with Beowulf, and he seems to know Beowulf better than himself at this point, I think. So to use what, at least in English, sounds like quite a jangling and unnatural stress, flags up, gives an impression of the otherness of Grendel. And the heptameter gives us a nice long period of time for that sense of stress to settle in. And indeed, for each character, formal poetic choices are made to achieve specific effects. But I won't. I think it'd be boring to go into all of them. But this has the general effect of distinguishing between character. So in a dramatic live sense, it really helps to mark character out as having different characteristics and also having different physicalities. Because with puppetry, when they've got a different rhythm and a different movement, it really helps to mark them out physically in the way that the puppets move, or at least that was the idea, and I think it was largely successful in that respect. So poetically speaking, the characters exist within a matrix of difference and similarity. So a last point to make with the textual considerations comes again to Beowulf being a Saxon text. Now I said that I had to eschew Old English, but there are lots of echoes of Old English in the poem. For example, heavy use of alliteration and lexical choice. So I've got here a Word-Hoard, which is a Saxon term to mean someone who's very articulate. Beowulf is described in the poem as unleashing his Word-Hoard on the company. So here are just an example of a few things that I used. So sometimes I was using words of sociological significance, such as ring-giver, thane, and atheling. So these are words specific to a Northern European warrior culture. But then also descriptive verbs and nouns, such as thole. If you're Scottish, or if you know anyone from the Highlands, there's still a verb that's in quite a lot of use. Kith, white, feared, and thane and atheling. So the aim here in using these words is to evoke the past and also give credence to the character of the poet as a Saxon poet and as someone from a distant though familiar culture. Now I think these considerations take us to then the theme of art and art making. Now, it was noted in my original reading of the poem that art is something which helps to solidify a sense of mutual history and is something which Grendel finds intolerable. So again, if you remember, the poet is described in Beowulf as telling of man's beginnings. Now, my adaptation takes this a step further and develops this idea of art as an institution. And rather than Grendel and Grendel's mother having an irrational hatred of humanity and art, they actually have a critique of it. So for example, with Grendel, Grendel is something of a Nietzschean Übermensch, someone who forgoes any kind of idea of being influenced by another human being, and who despises existential and moral weakness at all. And so indeed, Grendel sees the weakness and vanity of humanity, most especially in their need for kinship and art. And so Grendel tells the audience that he is in a state of needing hut, no hearth, no kin, no bread, no sword. I'm myself with little. Cripples, stop your mirth. Treasure deaths I do, like you treasure your metal hoards. So this conception of self that Grendel espouses stands against one where collective action and community are important. Grendel sees himself as a radically autonomous agent. The autonomy of Grendel claims to himself again goes hand in hand with his hatred of humans as artistically productive beings. So as we've seen, Grendel is aware of the influence of art before, where he says, "Yes, I'm real. To your stories, I'll not be compared." So marks up the inadequacy of art to actually represent reality. And he frames his destruction within the semantic field of music. So he says, "I come to strip the flesh from your melody." So this idea is developed and continued with Grendel's mother when she makes her appearance. And she has a debate in her chamber with Beowulf, and she uses a Saxon device here, sort of compound invectives, where she calls Beowulf a poetry pleaser, a story listener, and tells the hero, "Mark, you music meddler, my child needed no care. He was himself from birth, unlike men needing their fables, foes, and friends." So for both monsters that form the agons of the drama, humanity is reasonable because of the need for fellowship, recognition, and art. This is read by the monsters as a disturbance of the natural order and as a reprehensible and even destructive weakness. So Grendel's mother tells Beowulf that your circular revenge will have the world battle until the world's end. So the theme of art making is central to my approach in the adaptation. And indeed, it makes a lot of sense of Beowulf's character, because Beowulf is indeed, in my adaptation, someone who is thinking of his fame and his name, and to such an extent that it becomes an unhealthy obsession. So, and this obsession is fueled by a love of heroic verse and tales. Again, his love of art. Beowulf is absolutely and utterly infatuated with art, and there's indications of that in the original poem. So, before embarking towards Denmark, Beowulf tells his Fyrd, his company of men, "Mother's milk was laced with story, my bread was baked with poetry. On this ship you should join me now, you, my Fyrd, worthy company." So in these lines, Beowulf shows a powerful affiliation with the artistic output of his culture. So it's expressed as being something nourishing, being bread and mother's milk, but also rather quotidian, just a daily, rather normal thing. And I think the quotidian nature of heroic verse creates a tension here, because heroic acts are something that one is told about very often in works of art, but however they do hold themselves as acts that are uncommon and ideal. And this is also why Beowulf has a sort of a strange disdain of home, of Geatland. He claims that a hearth is where one tells of fame, a bed is where one slumbers, snores. And again, home is seen as a place where much is said but little seen. This tension between the quotidian and the extra-quotidian, sort of motivated by his uncritical acceptance of art, is emphasised near the end of the piece, while after he's just survived the fight with Grendel's mother, and he's sort of unconscious, Beowulf's first thoughts are ever more pursuit of fame. So he's just coming to here, so, and he's speaking to Hrothgar. The sky, the ground, high Heorot hall, these I note as though in fever. I recall acts, recount those boasts soon told by some story weaver. Hrothgar, even though I am weak, I beg to know of other wiles. Are there more phantoms in your realm or abroad? Are there other trials? So, in essence, in a way, Beowulf represents a more pathetic version of Don Quixote. Don Quixote is notable because he's obsessed with popular fiction and tales and believes they offer a transparent and unproblematic guide to action and morality. Though I think, as we've seen with, in Beowulf's development and in the conflicts with Grendel and Grendel's mother, this is a deeply problematic enterprise for him. So what I hope to have shown here is how a critical reading of the original can really inform an adaptation, and how a writer can engage in a fecund way with source material and indeed look at the academic and historical context of these things. And it really is a rich resource for writers and theatre practitioners.